Hey friends, thank you for taking time out of your week to spend a little with me. As always, I appreciate you. This week I had a couple of viewers ask me to talk about this case, so big thank you to both Shannon and Tasha. Our topic of discussion this week is all about Clifford Olson Jr., also known as the Beast of British Columbia, a name he rightly earned. So as always, I invite you all to join me as we remember the 11 victims of Clifford Olson. Clifford Robert Olson Jr. was born on January 1, 1940 in Vancouver, British Columbia to parents Leona and Clifford Olson. Shortly after he was born, they moved to Richmond, where Clifford grew up. Clifford was the oldest of 4 children, with his parents going on to have 3 more children, 2 boys and a girl. His father delivered milk and his mother worked at a fish cannery in order to provide for their children. From an early age, Clifford Jr. was described as being a bully, with his father recalling how he was always getting into fights. He was often called a compulsive talker and had the ability to manipulate and control any situation. At school, he was considered a loner and oftentimes misbehaved for attention, and he always seemed to be in trouble. By the age of 10, Clifford started committing acts of petty theft and would torment the stray animals in the neighborhood. He also became known for his scams. He would steal produce from his neighbors' backyards and resell them to unsuspecting owners. He would sell old lotto tickets, and he would steal the milk money off of various front porches. Clifford had an interest in wanting to box, which he did eventually do. However, Clifford wasn't the top athlete, but he was said to be very sportsmanlike by his coach. Clifford was also said to be of average intelligence, but he was very immature for his age, and he didn't enjoy school. So he just started skipping and would eventually drop out after the 8th grade. After dropping out, he found his first job at the Lansdowne racetrack. After dropping out, Clifford also graduated in his crimes. He started to commit a multitude of crimes including armed robbery, breaking and entering, and forgery. However, by the time he reached 17, he was arrested for the first time for a charge of breaking and entering. He was sentenced to 9 months at the New Haven Borstal Correctional Center in Burnaby. He managed to escape custody for a short period before being recaptured to finish his sentence. This would be a reoccurring pattern for the next 2 decades, where he spent all but 4 years of his adult life behind bars. He earned himself dozens of more charges and escaped police custody 6 more times between 1957 to 1968. Sometimes he was released early for good behavior, and he was eligible for parole twice in 1959 and 1972, but was revoked both times. As previously mentioned, Clifford was good with words and very manipulative. Some even described him as being charming. He used these personality traits to his advantage on both prisoners and guards alike for his personal gain. However, rubbing elbows with everyone helped Clifford gain a reputation for being a rat. He would take information given in secrecy and pass it along to prison officials if it meant benefiting himself. His new status resulted in him regularly being attacked. During one of these attacks, he was stabbed 7 times by a gang of prisoners because he revealed a drug smuggling operation. He was moved from prison to prison for his own safety. One of these moves landed him in the British Columbia Penitentiary, where he met and gained the trust of another prisoner, Gary Marcoux, in 1978. Gary and Clifford were being housed in the special unit due to their crimes, with Gary in particular being held for the brutal assault and murder of a 9-year-old girl. The pair became close friends, so close in fact that Gary not only disclosed all of the details of his crimes, but even went as far to write a detailed retelling with hand-drawn visuals. Of course, he only did this because Clifford conned him into it. What Gary didn't know was Clifford took these resources and supplied them to police in order to help secure a conviction against Gary. For his brave efforts, Clifford was awarded whatever he wanted. He even earned a commendation. Although Clifford claimed he was just trying to help to keep sickos like Gary off the streets, it turned out Clifford was very similar to his friend. He found a sort of joy in Gary's retellings, specifically the child-related assault and violent acts. He spent hours visualizing what Gary had done, and unbeknownst to law enforcement, Clifford used Gary's crimes as a sort of blueprint for his future acts. Clifford was released in 1980, where he picked up where he left off, continuing a life of crime. Several months after getting out of prison, Clifford met Joan, a divorcee who was smitten with him. Joan was nervous about a serious relationship, but because she found Clifford to be so charming, she was unbothered even after discovering he was fresh out of prison. Months after meeting Joan, Clifford took his first life. Christine Weller was a 12-year-old girl from Surrey, British Columbia, who disappeared on November 17, 1980. She spent the day at the Surrey Place Mall with her friends. She was supposed to return back to the Bonanza Hotel where her family lived by dinner time, but she didn't plan accordingly. She wouldn't make it home in time if she walked back, so she borrowed her friend's bike but never made it home. Christine was described as a tomboy and happy. It wasn't uncommon to find her hanging around outside, and she would often go stay at friends' houses without telling her parents, which is what they assumed when she never came home for dinner. Christine's parents brushed off her disappearance for a week before they called police to file a missing persons report. Even after the report was filed, police treated her case as a runaway. That was until the bike she was last seen on was found a few blocks away from the motel. On Christmas Day 1980, a man walking his dog along an embankment stumbled upon her body. Christine was found strangled with a belt and she suffered from 19 stab wounds. Law enforcement would be completely unaware that this would only be the first of many children to suffer a similar fate. And Clifford just kept living life as usual. After a very short courting period, Clifford moved in with Joan, who fell pregnant just months later, and the two planned to marry. Their son, Clifford III, was born in April of 1981. While the police were probing the murder of Christine, another girl from Surrey turned up missing. On April 16, 1989, 13-year-old Colleen Degnault was waiting for the bus around 1 p.m. when a man in a vehicle pulled up next to her and offered her a ride. Colleen was shy and did not like talking to strangers, but after much coercion from the driver, she agreed to the ride. During the ride, the man introduced himself as Clifford and explained to the teen that he was a contractor and had his own business, and he was always in the market for good help, and if she was willing, he would compensate her substantially. Colleen was eager. Most teens wanted the freedom of their own income, so she listened as he continued on. After ensuring she was comfortable, Clifford offered her a drink which unknowingly contained a drug that intoxicated Colleen and prevented her from moving effectively. Colleen was taken to a secluded location where she was assaulted and then murdered. She was reported missing after 3 days, but much like Christine, she was treated as a runaway. That was until clothing was located in the Surrey forest just days before Colleen's birthday. Her family confirmed they belonged to her. On September 17, 1981, skeletal remains were found in the clothing that were later determined to be Colleen's. 5 days after Colleen's disappearance, another child went missing. Darren Johnsrud, who was 16 at the time, vanished on April 22, 1981. He was visiting his mother in Vancouver at the time during a holiday break. Darren was described as an easygoing kid. On that fateful April day, his mother asked him if he would run an errand to the nearby drugstore, and Darren was last seen at this drugstore. His body would not be recovered until May 2, 1981. He was found to be bludgeoned with a hammer and left at the bottom of a rocky embankment. On May 14, 1981, the night before his wedding, Clifford was asked to babysit several children while his fiancée and friends went out to celebrate the upcoming nuptials. Clifford sent the older children to the corner store for candy while he hung back with a 5-year-old girl, where allegedly he assaulted her. He was asked to give a statement to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police when the mother filed a complaint against him. Clifford agreed but denied everything. The girl was too young to testify against him and no physical evidence existed, so no charges were brought against him. Then, the following day, May 15, 1981, Joan and Clifford married. Allegedly, Joan stated after the birth of their son, their relationship suffered. Clifford became more violent towards her and started drinking more. 4 days after his wedding, Clifford struck again. Sandra Wolfsteiner was 16 years old and living in Langley when she disappeared. At the time, she was living with her sister, and on May 19, 1981, she spent the day in Surrey visiting her boyfriend and his mother before she decided to head back home around 11:30 a.m. She hitched a ride from a stranger to make her journey shorter, and her boyfriend's mother watched Sandra get picked up by a man in a silver gray, two-door, medium-sized car, and it would be the last time anyone saw her alive. It's speculated, like few before, Clifford offered Sandra a good-paying job in order to coerce her to join him at his cabin secluded in the woods. This cabin was allegedly located within the forest off Chilliwack Lake Road, and the pair had to walk the rest of the way. However, while walking to the cabin, Clifford smashed Sandra in the back of the head and left her in those woods. When Sandra was reported missing, her case followed the same pattern, where she was considered a runaway. Later that same month, Clifford was arrested on unrelated charges when he picked up a 16-year-old girl from Agassiz. After being pulled over for his erratic driving, police interviewed the girl, who claimed she didn't think he was going to hurt her, but admitted he bought her drinks and attempted to give her drugs, which she did not take. She pocketed the pill, which was later identified as chloral hydrate. He was charged with impaired driving and contributing to the delinquency of a minor. But he wouldn't be behind bars long. He was released on bail sometime later. Then, on June 21, 1981, victim number 5 was claimed. Ada Quartz was 13 years old and lived in Burnaby. The night before she went missing was a Saturday, and a very typical one. She often spent her weekends in her brother's apartment in Coquitlam babysitting his 2 toddlers. She got up early the next morning and caught the bus in order to meet up with her boyfriend, but she never made it and was reported missing when she didn't come home. In Ada's case, a witness would come forward a month or 2 after her disappearance. The man claimed at the time he didn't know what he was witnessing, but around 8 p.m. on June 21st, he was driving around the popular Weaver Lake area when he came across a man beside a black truck bending over the body of a young girl. He thought they were in trouble, so he stopped and offered his assistance, but was not met with open arms. The man refused to answer any of his questions, so the witness got back into his vehicle after feeling like something was off. The man immediately started chasing him down with what felt like ill intent. The witness swerved onto a side road where he lost the man. The witness didn't understand what happened until after the information of the missing girl went public. Ada's remains would not be discovered until over a year later in August of 1981, when her skull and jawbone were uncovered near Weaver Lake. By the end of June, Clifford was responsible for 5 deaths, but only Christine and Darren had been recovered, but police were not connecting the two as related cases. Then on July 2, 1981, the disappearance of Simon Partington, a boy from Surrey, was the turning point of the many cases of missing children in and near the area. It was Simon's disappearance that police started to think that all of these deaths were not a coincidence, and they were all connected. They dubbed the investigation the case of the missing Lower Mainland children. Simon's case was so different because of his age. Police felt he was far too young to be a runaway. The morning of his disappearance, Simon did his usual routine of breakfast and getting ready for the day. He left his home around 10:30 a.m. for his friend's house, but he never arrived. He disappeared just blocks from where Christine Weller went missing as well. Simon's case resulted in a public outcry for answers, which really expedited the investigation. It launched the largest manhunt at the time, with police admitting foul play was suspected. Simon was later discovered strangled to death. All of the media attention over Simon didn't startle Clifford, though, and he continued on. 5 days after taking Simon, Clifford picked up another 16-year-old and her friend. Much like previous victims, he offered the girls jobs and drinks. He separated the 16-year-old from her friend, where he put on unwanted advances. When she refused, he stopped, and for some reason, he let her go. He was later charged with indecent assault in relation to the girl. On July 9, 1981, Clifford and 18-year-old Randy Ludlow were hanging out in Coquitlam. Clifford purchased drinks, and the pair drove around with no real plans. Randy was unaware that just a week before, Clifford had taken a life and was charged with assault. Randy recalled on that day between 11 a.m. and noon, he was riding with Clifford when the pair spotted a girl leaving a phone booth on Columbia Street. Randy stated Clifford must have known the girl since he waved her down and she smiled back at him. Clifford then pulled the car over and the girl came over to talk. She introduced herself as Judy Cosma, and at the time, Judy was trying to make her way to Richmond to visit a friend and also apply for a job. Clifford and Judy had met previously at her current job at McDonald's. Clifford offered her a ride, stating it would be faster than the bus, and Judy agreed. The trio headed for Richmond, where Clifford offered Judy and Randy more drinks. They arrived early for her interview, so rather than waiting around, they got more beer. However, Judy decided she had had too much to drink already, but Clifford encouraged her to keep going. He offered her some medication that he claimed would prevent her from getting intoxicated, and she believed him, so she took them. After about an hour, Clifford decided to drop Randy off at a nearby mall so he could take Judy to her appointment. But in reality, he drove her to a secluded place where she was assaulted and then strangled. Randy had no clue he would be the last person to see Judy alive, and when he saw Clifford again, he told Randy he dropped her off and hadn't seen her since. Judy's body was recovered on July 25th from Lake Weaver. After disposing of Judy, Clifford took her small green address book that was in her possession as some sort of trophy. The next day, on July 10th, Clifford packed up his wife and son for a family vacation to California, where he would be until July 21st, 1981. During this hiatus, Clifford finally became a blip on investigators' radars when his name was brought up at a law enforcement conference on July 15th in relation to the Ada Quartz case. Clifford's previous assault crimes and the fact he was living in the same apartment complex as her brother threw up a red flag, and he was officially considered a suspect in the case of the missing Lower Mainland children, and surveillance was placed on him. But this surveillance would be rather random, since at the time of Clifford's crimes, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police's chain of command underwent a dramatic upheaval in the summer of 1981, with staff shortages and low morale, which affected the daily operations, which also coincided with Clifford's tailing. The sporadicness of the surveillance allowed Clifford to claim 4 more lives. On July 23, 1981, Clifford was home for vacation for 2 days before he found another victim. 15-year-old Raymond King Jr. was out of school for the summer and on the hunt for his first job. He spent most of his days going to the Canada Manpower Youth Employment Center, and the day he went missing was no different, except on this day he met Clifford. Clifford lured Raymond away with the promise of a job. He agreed to join Clifford in his vehicle, where the two then drove along the highway towards Weaver Lake. Once off the main stretch, they exited the car to walk the path to Clifford's supposed cabin, but during this walk he attacked him. Clifford staved the boy in the head with a rock. After his death, Clifford disposed of his body down a steep hillside trail. When Raymond didn't return home, his father reported him missing, where police at first assumed he was a runaway. 2 days after Raymond, Clifford struck again. Sigrun Arndt was a student from Weinheim, Germany, visiting Coquitlam. She was last seen alive with a man at a local pub and later on a train with the same man. Her body was found on August 8, 1981 in Richmond, partly buried in a trench. The day after her discovery, Simon would also be found nearly 400 yards away. Sigrun at first wasn't part of the missing children's case. She was only later added after Clifford confessed to taking her life as well. On July 27, 1981, Terry Lynn Carson, aged 15 at the time, left her family home that Monday morning, around 8 a.m. While heading to her destination, Clifford stumbled upon her and offered her a ride. Terry was like other students off for the summer, in need of a job, and according to Clifford, he had positions to offer. During this ride, she was given a laced drink, and as Clifford said, it was a celebration since Terry found employment. However, Terry quickly noticed she was feeling the effects. Clifford took her, like many others, to a rural, forested area where he strangled her, burned her clothes, and discarded her shoes and purse into the Fraser River. Clifford was a prime suspect for the child murders, and he was under surveillance. The problem, though, was Clifford was aware of the surveillance, and because of this, they dropped it on July 29th, but it would later be reinstated. On July 30th, 1981, Constable Fred Miley with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police of the Serious Crimes Unit developed a strategy for possibly trapping Clifford. He invited him to a restaurant called The White Spot, where Detective Tarr sat in to have a conversation with Clifford. The conversation was transmitted to investigators nearby, and the idea was to insinuate the police were going to offer a reward for information about the murders, or give up who might be responsible if not him. The conversation, as described in the book Final Payoff, went as follows. Detective, quote, "Quite a few homicides around here, right? And we understand you might be able to tell us, or help us, but we have to know you are able to help us," end quote. Clifford said nothing at first, but finally broke his silence. He told investigators he wanted to be hired at a salary of $3,000 a month, and in exchange he would provide any information he could about the disappearances. He explained he didn't know anything, but he had a way of finding out information. He told the detective, quote, "Well, I'll get back to you if I find out anything," end quote, and then he just got up and left without being followed. And on that same day, he murdered 17-year-old Louise Chartrand. After his meeting with police, he decided to pay a visit to his lawyer. However, on the way, he spotted Louise. Clifford managed to lure her into his car and get her intoxicated before driving her out toward Whistler, nearly 45 minutes from where he picked her up. He turned off the highway onto a gravel pit north of a nearby ski resort, where he smashed her skull in with a hammer, then buried her in a shallow grave. Louise was the youngest of 7 and lived in the Fraser Valley town of Maple Ridge, and police believed the day she disappeared she hitchhiked part of the way to work her night shift as a waitress. She made it to work, but according to coworkers, after her shift she walked to a store downtown. The store was a 10-minute walk from the restaurant. Then the next day came and Louise didn't show up for her shift, which wasn't like her. Her employers contacted her family to see what was going on, and Louise never made it home the previous night. Her sister immediately contacted the police, and the police were sure this time that foul play was involved. The summer of 1981 had Vancouver and surrounding areas gripped in terror as news outlets reported the possibility of a serial killer. A task force was already in place for investigating not only the disappearances but suspects as well, and much like the police force, it too was being restructured. By the beginning of August, Superintendent Bruce Northrup was put on to lead the investigation into the children and, more importantly, paying a closer look at their prime suspect, Clifford Olson. Clifford and his family took another trip, this time to Alberta, but when he returned on August 6th, surveillance continued at the behest of Northrup. But Clifford was not an easy target to follow. He would go out of his way to make random stops in the middle of streets and turn his car in the opposite direction, purposely turn down dead-end roads just to reverse out moments later, and consistently switching rental cars. He would also drive at all hours of the day. But eventually, Clifford would slip up. On August 12, 1981, while driving around on Vancouver Island, Clifford picked up 2 female hitchhikers. He was erratically driving across the highway before he turned down a logging road, unaware he was being tailed by police. Before anything could happen, officers blocked the logging road in case he attempted to flee. In the distance, one of the officers saw 3 individuals standing beside a car, and he quickly approached them. He announced his presence, and Clifford quickly jumped into his car, but thankfully could not go anywhere. He was arrested on charges of impaired and dangerous driving, and the 2 girls were unharmed. After Clifford was in custody, his vehicle was searched, where they finally found something to connect him to the missing children: a little address book belonging to Judy Cosma. At the police station, interrogation began and would be a long 6 days before Clifford finally broke. At the time of his arrest, only 3 bodies were discovered and identified. Police had no idea just how many more would turn up. On August 18, 1981, Clifford was charged with the first-degree murder of Judy Cosma through a full confession. However, when they started pressing about the other missing persons, Clifford stopped talking. He told police he would give them the bodies and information if they gave him $100,000. He wanted $10,000 deposited into a trust fund for his wife and son every time he led them to one of the victims. He said the first one was a freebie, so they knew he wasn't lying. This deal became known as the Cash for Bodies deal, and Clifford proposed a schedule to recover the remaining victims one at a time, starting with Louis Chartrand, his final victim. With each body, he also promised a detailed statement and all of the evidence, things only the killer would know, according to Clifford. After immense pressure, police and prosecution felt obligated to take Clifford on his deal. However, it was not disclosed to the public due to fear of disrupting Clifford's right to a fair trial. But the deal would be leaked to the public a year later, and the public was not only outraged but disgusted by the idea of Clifford profiting from his crimes. Despite the overall feeling of the Cash for Bodies deal, the task force and police alike were relieved to finally solve the murders, but also bring a semblance of closure for those families affected. Clifford didn't hold back on his part either. He produced evidence pertaining to several of his victims. In exchange of $100,000, the Attorney General's office were able to secure a first-degree murder charge for 11 counts against Clifford. On January 11, 1981, Clifford pled guilty to his charges and received 11 concurrent life sentences with no parole eligibility for 25 years. However, in the form of a loophole, in August of 1997, Clifford was able to apply for parole earlier than expected under the faint hope clause of the Criminal Code, which allowed prisoners to seek early release after serving 15 years of their sentence. But Clifford's application was dismissed after only 15 minutes of review. Clifford continued to bid for parole. He had hearings in both 2006 and 2010, but was denied at every attempt. Since he'd undergone several psychiatric appointments where it was determined Clifford was not only untreatable but even more dangerous than he was when he was first convicted, due to what he referred to as his quote-unquote celebrity status, in which Clifford was trying to claim a title of ultimate serial killer. The parents of the victims wrote to Federal Solicitor General Kaplan begging for action to be taken regarding the Cash for Bodies deal involving their children and potential income from future publications of his crimes. The plea was supported by hundreds of thousands of signatures from the public, but sadly it didn't make a difference, and the family's plight was not taken seriously. But they would not stop, especially with the growing support of their communities. With no help from governmental agencies, 7 of the families decided to instead sue Clifford, Joan, Clifford's lawyer Robert Shantz, and the lawyer overseeing the Cash for Bodies deal, McNeely. And to accomplish such a feat, 2 lawyers offered their services free of charge in order to fix this wrong. The case was stalled by Joan and her legal team for nearly 3 years, but eventually the deal was examined by the Supreme Court of British Columbia, and a decision was reached on December 7, 1984. The judge ruled in favor of the victims' families. The $100,000 needed to be returned to the court, and legal fees would need to be paid by Shantz, McNeely, and Joan. But what seemed like a victory was short-lived when the case was appealed. The appeal was heard on March 11, 1986, in which the original ruling was reversed on the grounds that the original judge made an error in the way he dealt with the requirements to be satisfied before the principle of unjust enrichment would apply. Essentially, the families had to prove that they were deprived when funds were paid to McNeely for the deal. They determined it was clear the payments made by police to McNeely were not for the deaths of children, but for gathering evidence to secure a conviction for the murder of the children. So ultimately, the money had to be returned back from the court to the trust fund with McNeely. On March 12, 1986, the families filed a motion for leave of appeal from the previous judgment, but the decision was upheld by the Supreme Court of British Columbia on June 23, 1986. Clifford was confined to a maximum security institution in Quebec where even behind bars he continued to torment the victims' families and managed to make media headlines. He wrote manuscripts detailing his hideous crimes, such as how he would enjoy driving nails into them and asking over and over how it felt. He also arranged for taped interviews in hopes of selling them off to anyone interested. He would also call and write the victims' families, but thankfully this behavior was put to rest after his initial parole hearing. Clifford claimed on multiple occasions he was responsible for many more unsolved murders, including some that he committed alone and some with a friend. Although it cannot be confirmed, police do believe Clifford was responsible for at least 4 other unsolved murders. On October 2, 2011, at the age of 71, Clifford died of cancer while incarcerated. He spent a total of 30 years behind bars, and despite this continued to be notable since he often was the reason changes were made in Canadian law. These changes included adding restrictions on early parole for murderers and the eventual elimination of the faint hope clause. He also was the reason federal pensions were denied to certain prisoners due to receiving his old age security payments. The government was outraged to find out they were funding the living expenses for violent criminals and wanted to put an end to it, so a law was enacted to ban this from continuing to happen. His crimes also resulted in increased time periods between parole hearings for multiple murder cases and spurred the victims' rights movement, which created a police tracking system for offenders of violent crimes. Thank you again to Shannon and Tasha for suggesting this case. As always, I'm interested in hearing your thoughts and opinions, so leave them below and we can chat about it. If you found this to be informative, please consider giving the video a thumbs up to let YouTube know you want more. And lastly, if you're not subscribed yet, please do. We would love to have you under the ash tree. I'm really close to almost 50,000 friends, and that blows my mind compared to where I was last year. And I have all of you to thank for that. I'm not giving up hope on reaching my personal goal of 100,000 friends by the end of the year, so fingers crossed. Thank you to each and every one of you who continue to support and love what I do here. I think you guys are all the best, and I hope you have a great week. But until then, I will see you in the next one. Bye, friends.